So the diagram below illustrates a feeding relationship in an ecosystem. Study it carefully and answer the questions as follows. So the first question says, what is the name given to the feeding relationship illustrated in the diagram above? The feeding relationship illustrated is a food chain. List all the producers in the illustration. The producers are cabbage, carrots, then grass. List all consumers in the illustration and classify them into primary, secondary, and tertiary consumers. So the rabbit is a primary consumer, the mouse is a primary consumer, the grasshopper is also a primary consumer. You have a bird here who is also acting as a secondary consumer. You have an owl here which is acting as a secondary consumer. And then we have the fox here which is acting as a tertiary consumer. Then the ivy says write out two possible food chains for the illustration above. So two possible food chains. We have one here and another one here. So we have grass, then arrow pointing towards the grasshopper, then an arrow pointing towards the bird. We can also have the cabbage with an arrow pointing towards the rabbit, an arrow pointing towards the fox. Then the next question says, explain why the ecosystem illustrated by the above feeding relation is likely to be artificial. It's likely to be artificial because it's in a regulated area by men. Looking at everything, it looks like it's on a farm or in a wildlife reserve. Now in an ecosystem, we expect that all the organisms should live freely. This feeding relationships looks like it's in an ecosystem that is controlled by man. Then the VI says, state two farming practices that can negatively affect the ecosystem illustrated above. So overgrazing in livestock farming can affect this, and then also the use of pesticide can also affect this food chain. We have the diagram below is an illustration of a habitat. Study it and answer the questions that follow. So the I says name the habitat. This is a pond. The II says name the term used to describe the interacting organisms in the habitat. So as the organisms are interacting with each other, what is the term given to them? It's called a community. III. What term is used to describe the interaction between organisms and their environment? So the term is ecosystem. Then the IV says name each of the parts labeled I to IV. I here looks like a herbivorous animal, specifically a sheep. And the II here is an aquatic plant. Then the III is mosquito pupa. And then IV is a fish. So the vein says in what way do the organisms II and IV depend on each other? So II here is the water lily, and then IV here is a fish. So the II releases oxygen into the water body or the atmosphere, and then the fish uses the oxygen to break down food, which is known as respiration. Then the fish in turn also releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere for the plant to use it to make its own food. Another thing is also the fish excretes ammonia into the water body, and then the plant also use the nutrients to make its own food and also prevent the infestation of algae to take over the whole pond. Then the VI says name a disease which is associated with organism III. The disease is malaria. The next question says the diagram below is an illustration of how energy flows among organisms in the ecosystem. Study it carefully and answer the questions that follows. So we have an illustration here First question says, what name is given to the illustration above? Now the illustration above here is a food chain. And it says, which of the organisms in the illustration above is or are producer? So the producer, you have the plant. Then with the primary consumer, you have the moth, grasshopper, the herbivorous bug. How do I know? Realize that they are all depending directly on the plant. They are all depending directly on the plant. Then the next one is the tertiary consumer. The tertiary consumer here is the lizard. Why? Because it's the apex predator. It's found at the peak of the food web. The next question says, where does plant get its energy from? The plant gets its energy from the sun. Then which of the organisms receive the most energy? The organism that receives the most energy is the plant, and the least energy. Organism that receives the least energy is the lizard. Then the next question says, what will happen when there are no lizards, praying mantis, and predator bug in this ecosystem? Now there will be overpopulation of the herbivorous bug and the grasshopper, which will lead to overgrazing and then reduce the population of the plants. So there's this question I keep seeing that why is an ecosystem a self-sustaining unit? So when we say something is self-sustaining, it means it is able to sustain its own self. It doesn't need support from other places. It is independent. So an ecosystem is a self-sustaining unit because organisms in it may feed on it, but the same organisms would help to replenish whatever has been lost. For example, you have zebras and buffaloes, which are herbivorous animals. They feed on the grasses and vegetation. So after eating, give off feces. Now this feces serves as manure to the soil. So once their population is being controlled and then they defecate, their droppings serve as manure to the soil so as to allow the growth of this vegetation. So this question says, match the correct names of the trophic levels to the diagram of the food web below. So since you know, you saw the possible answers. Okay, so we have the food web here with grass and other organisms I wouldn't want to mention, but we can all see their names. So we are asked to label the trophic level. Now when we say a trophic level is a position of an organism occupies on a food chain or on the energy pyramid. Now the arrows that you see on a food chain or a food web shows the transfer of energy. The trophic level on organisms is very important because it tells the amount of energy that the organism receives based on the trophic level it finds itself. Organisms that are closer to the producers tend to have more energy, and organisms that are away from the producer tend to have low energy. So looking at this, the number 4 here is the producer. So that's the answer. The trophic level number 4 is the producer. Trophic level number 3 is the primary consumer. Number 2 here is secondary consumer. Number 1 here is tertiary consumer.